So, hello and welcome to VistaTalks, interesting discussions with interesting people from all around the world. I'm your host for today, Simon Hodgkins, and I'm delighted to be joined once again for the second time here on VistaTalks by our very own Unn Villius. You're very welcome, Unn.
Thank you very much. Happy to be back again. It's been a while, I think, hasn't it?
It's been too long and a lot has happened, so I'm dying to get into this discussion with you. So let's move on. Let's get on to the show. And let's start, for people who may not be as familiar with you as I am, let's have a little brief discussion about your localization journey up to today. For those listening, you're the Chief Sales Officer of the Vistatec organization, fundamental to getting Vistatec started off in the USA. And I know that your localization career started off as a Swedish linguist at Microsoft back in '88, if I can say that.
You can say that, and isn't that remarkable, seeing that I'm only 29? But
it's incredible. Look,
my standard line. Yes.
Look, you've had a wide variety of positions in this busy, and getting busier world of localization. So maybe just tell us a little bit about that first, Unn.
Yeah. So of course, those were very different times, and Ireland was pretty much the cradle of localization, I guess. And as much as things have changed, a lot of things still are the same. It's surprising to me how many people even today, when you ask them how they got into this business, sort of slipped in the way I did. Yeah. Even when there are programs for getting educated, widely in Ireland and all over the US and elsewhere in the world. But from my perspective, I was on a 6-month sort of sabbatical in Ireland that kept getting extended. And when Microsoft moved Swedish and Dutch from having been centered in Redmond for localization over to their office in Ireland, I happened to be there, and I happened to be Swedish. I knew nothing about computers or technology. I certainly wasn't a linguist, but they hired me, and that was it. So I started as a, whatever the title might have been back then, but I pretty much localized one product for a year into one language, and that certainly has changed.
Well, look, for sure. And I know you said in an interview at one stage that you'd walk through almost every discipline in the localization industry. You joined Vistatec back in '97.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you successfully established Vistatec's first US office.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm sure you've seen an awful lot of change from today's sales and commercial perspective. I mean, let me ask you about that. I mean, today, from a commercial perspective, the pain points today and the areas that these large global organizations are looking for the most assistance with, what are they like today? Are they really, really bespoke today? Or do you still see that similarity to, 20 odd years ago?
In a way. So I think the newer companies, it's very interesting, companies that are unicorns or up and comings, or, and I wouldn't even say .coms because that's a very old concept, but companies that are starting out today are thinking differently, and they're actually often thinking globally from the outset, if that is their ultimate ambition. Where you see the older behavior is still in the more traditional companies. I'm going to put that in a bit of context, right? So when we started out all those years ago, localization as a discipline was pretty much limited to the IT industry. So, Microsoft was no accident, right? That was, they kind of wrote the book in the early days. But these days, all content is digital and online and available for the same, in theory, localization processes that have been established and, of course, fine-tuned and developed over the years. But the older companies, which have needed to start thinking about this differently, fairly recently, for them, it's a much heavier lift. They are the ones that have issues centralizing, where people may not have a real appreciation for what global content means. I'm sure it's just words. Why is it so hard, And there are little pockets everywhere over those, around those organizations where stuff is being translated, nobody's noticing. It's not even a line item. So for those companies to really embrace the idea of global content as a cross-functional, centralized place where you can really reap some economics of scales and benefits, that's still a big lift for some of them. And they may not have been doing this for all that long, but the company itself can be quite, is old, established, and usually massive.
No, great points on, and you sort of mentioned that sort of fast growing, going global from day one, sort of the unicorn, if I can use that term, heavily funded organization. And then you've got maybe organizations that have been around before the internet was around.
Well, absolutely. And there are many of them, right?
Right. Yeah. Big, massive global brands that we all know that have been maybe pre-internet and are now somewhere on a digital transformation journey, aren't they?
Absolutely. And that's a big ask, right?
Yeah.
And of course, even bigger with the pandemic, I think provoked, if that's a good word, change that would have been kind of in the making for a long time. And suddenly people had to really think about how they were doing business pretty much overnight. So people are scrambling to a degree.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment, because the pandemic has impacted businesses around the world, hasn't it?
Of course.
Most brands have had to shift to this online presence. And some of the biggest companies are really struggling to make that shift. Some have done very well during the pandemic, but like, what are you seeing on? Are people looking for help to move into this digital space, or is it people that are already in the digital space just need to do more of it because it's growing? And what's the impact of that when it comes to the content? Because you've said before that global content, it just seems to continue to grow, whether it's audio, video, or the written word. So maybe if you could maybe expand a little bit on this growing content that we're seeing and this sort of impact that the pandemic's had. What's your view on it?
Well, so I think there are some converging meta trends here. One, of course, being digital transformation, as you mentioned, and companies having to really think digital first. That got, really, was really accelerated by the pandemic, and people who might have had nice laid plans for the next 10 years on how to get there, so suddenly had to really shift gears overnight and act much more quickly. You see some people there are some interesting cases, people who had started, brick and mortar kind of combined with digital before the pandemic, but were moving in that direction. They had a much easier time than the ones that maybe thought, okay, we'll get there like in 2025, right? You had to really change your thinking. But the other trend that's happening at the same time is, of course, growing wealth and changing expectations in certain countries. It's really interesting, say with the Indian subcontinent, where English might have been accepted as a business language until fairly recently. And now we are seeing continuously that's no longer acceptable. There is enough, the expectations are changing in India. They want content in their language. They do not want to be spoken to in a language that is not their own anymore. So the demand on this is just a side note, but the demand on Indian languages is becoming very high. And we're going to see that elsewhere as well. It's, so back in the day, figs and Japanese, right? That's long gone. And at least, but as I said, it's really now the long tail is not that long anymore. Or even if it's long, it's much thicker.
Right. So not only the content type is exploding, but the requirements for certain languages is becoming really important.
Yeah. And of course, then you're dealing with having to the timeframes. So how do you break up your content in such a fashion that it can be more or less continuously published, and not to 10 or 15 or 20 locales, but 50, 80, 120.
Yeah, it's a big difference, isn't it? Yeah.
So you really need to think infrastructure, automation, take any friction that you can out of the process and concentrate your talent on where it's needed, to the exceptions and unpredictable, where people really add value, automate everything else. But in order to do that, you need to kind of get back to the drawing board and really think about what is your content, what is your content infrastructure? What do you have? What goes where?
Really strategic, really big strategic decisions in some cases.
Absolutely.
So can I ask you, when you talk about infrastructure, so I know two topics that are close to your heart are TMSs and the localization decision-making process for companies.
Yeah.
Now, what are your views on this, because obviously the world of TMSs can be quite varied for lots of organizations. To some organizations, they don't know what it is. So you've got a huge disparity. But then you've got sort of the decision to localize and making that decision and working with somebody. And then sort of how that TMS and that infrastructure sort of plays together. What are your views on that? What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, and it probably goes back even further, but there are a couple of kind of principles, I guess. I think that's what you're referring to, that are kind of near and dear to my heart. And by the way, as a side note, I want to give a little shout out to NIMSI, who published their global language technology roadmap, or atlas, excuse me, the other day. And holy, it is.
Yeah, it's not getting any smaller, is it? It's a juggernaut of information.
Oh my God, there are so many companies out there, and I think you can expect consolidation over time, but as you consolidate, new ones are going to pop up. So it's who knows what this will look like even a couple of years down the road. So a couple of points. If I was starting out on a localization journey as a company today, I wouldn't go out and try to buy a TMS, because I think it is going to be too slow, and it's going to be too many moving parts. It's just a little bit daunting. You may, I mean, if you're coming from somewhere, that there's something that fits you, by all means do it. But the most important point of what I think is, you should not buy tech and services from the same company. It's a risk management decision, and it's also, you don't want to paint yourself into a corner in the early days. Most companies out there, us included, have a good knowledge about what's suitable, what isn't, enough tools in our quiver that we can support the content that's needed to go global in the early days. So from a crawl, walk around perspective, do it with a trusted partner, use technology that's portable, and once you know more and have a greater insight and maybe have your landscape mapped out a little bit further, by all means, at some point, go out and buy your TMS. But you really want to keep things flexible and separate in the early days. I think that I tech and services thing is still important to me. So I think if you go out to buy a TMS, you don't want to buy services from that same company. And if you buy services, you don't want to be painted into a completely bespoke and homegrown TMS either. So keep flexibility, manage risk, keep flexibility. That would be my advice. I have my parallel story here is my dad buying this, all-in-one stereo equipment in the 1970s, turntable, radio, cassette deck, speakers. Of course, 3 days in, something broke, and then what do you do?
Okay. So flexibility seems to be the watchword here.
Exactly, and modular, right? You take a modular approach, so you have blocks that are that's a much more that's a safer approach, less risk prone, and you really want to eliminate the friction and risk out of the process as much as you can. Yeah.
No, that's good. So from a flexibility perspective, that leads me nicely onto the next thing I wanted to ask you, which is about, I know you've been heavily involved, and you've referenced the term already in our discussion about digital first, and companies working with a digital first approach, or working with Vistatec's digital first strategy. I know that a lot of organizations on this digital transformation road that we've been talking about, these sort of being agile and flexible when it comes to their global content delivery to their audiences, their customers, their own people. It's become a very important strategy. You rightly said earlier, the pandemic has really speeded this up, hasn't it?
Yes.
But you've done a lot of work with sort of digital natives, digital pioneers, digital explorers, and you've sort of categorized as part of the strategy companies into different groups. And how beneficial has that been to companies? Are you finding a lot of interest in that digital first strategy that you've deployed maybe over the last year, 2 years maybe?
Yes, I think this is something, of course, again, that the pandemic brought to the fore in terms of what people really need to do. I think the categorization is helpful in terms of where do you start. The digital natives are clearly the ones with that are thinking this way as they start out, and it makes the process a lot easier, because they're less likely to create little cubby holes where, you know, content is being created in 55 million different ways and then having to scramble to pull it all together. And I think really that is one of the big challenges for the digital explorers, which are the companies that we really talked about earlier on, that are far from being digital natives, have had to, I think in the past, maybe taken an approach that says, okay, if we must, we'll do it. But that means that if you don't do it with an overall strategy starting out, it's going to be piecemeal. You're creating silos, little cubby holes, things are being done in different ways in different parts of the company. This particular division is using, you know, this content management system, and a different division could be using something entirely different, right? So you have this plethora of things that have been pieced together over time. And now suddenly you're going to have to take a step back and go, this is probably not efficient. And where do we start in order to actually create an infrastructure that supports the speed at which global content needs to be created these days? And so I think our approach, and there's a lot of resources on our website, I think would be very helpful and interesting to people who are really trying to think about global content and how global content will drive, you know, their branding and revenue going forward. Okay,
no, that's really interesting, because sometimes when people talk about being digital first and digital transformation, there's an applied assumption that everybody moves at the same time. And you've brought a really interesting point to that, because within large organizations, and particularly global organizations, there are these pockets that you're referring to, aren't there? And they're all moving at different speeds and different programs and different tools and different infrastructure. And that's a really important point when you get into the whole digital first strategy, which, as you say, is significantly tied to the requirements that an organization in today's world has, which is content at speed almost. So
absolutely. And, you know, at the end of the day, there's also people to consider. There are, you know, processes, there are assets, but there are also people. And one thing to think about in the digital first strategy creation is also, I think, the localization maturity model from CSA, which is quite helpful in terms of how you deal with, and of course that model deals with all of the aspects I just mentioned, but very importantly with people, and how do you bring people who might be, you know, I think what is the lowest rate on their scale is hostile, which is, you know, sometimes not untrue, but into this whole ecosystem that you need to build, you know, and making them part of that process rather than you know, doing it despite their potential objections. So you need to really explain to people what you're trying to achieve, make sure that picture is clear, and then, you know, probably find a good garden project to start with and show success, so you can then start roping in the rest of the organization. I still talk about, you know, I call it dark matter, right? There's still going to be these little areas where things are happening and you just don't know what they are. And trying
That's very good. I like
you know, 80-20 rule, right? The last 20% might take a very long time, but at that point, the return on investment is probably worth it, but it's not as high as it will be, you know, for the more obvious areas that you need to deal with.
I love the term dark matter. That's a great way of bringing that to top of mind. Yeah. Can I ask you a quick side question on what you've said?
Sure.
Because while you were talking there, it made me think about the importance of localization. And I suppose, you know, back in 97, I'm guessing it wasn't as high up on the radar as it is today. And from what you're describing there, it sounds as though this is a really fundamental strategic decision that companies are not just need to make, but they're having to make it. It's so high up now. Or am I wrong in saying that? Like, is it as high as the perception I'm getting here?
I think there's both a push and a pull, right? So there clearly, for if you want to take your business international, yes, it is absolutely a must And as I said, the expectations, and of course, I should have mentioned regulations as well for content to be accepted, and you to be able to sell your products in different countries, or pushing it back. I think there's also a certain amount of pulling that it's actually digital first means it's also easier. You don't have to, you don't have to print 50,000, manuals of, this a stack this high. In the old tech products, you might have, literally a box of printed materials that is no longer needed. That's not how, so there is an awful lot of physical requirements that have gone away, unless you are a company that actually requires, things like airports and warehouses. But when you get to from the end customer's perspective, the global content can really, be a huge driver of global revenue these days. Without, a lot of infrastructure is actually gone, which is fantastic. And the other, that's important. I think the other thing, of course, is, the other meta trend out there. I thought that is obvious to anyone, is globalization itself, right? So in spite of, we've seen some traces of nativism, I guess, in the last 5 years or so, but in spite of that you can't stop this juggernaut. It's just going to go on.
Okay, no, great points, on. Thank you. So let's go in a slightly different direction now, and I just wanted to touch on. I know you're a Think Global Forward ambassador and have been for a long while now, and you've been involved in lots of the events. But one of the things I wanted to touch on was the fact that we're rapidly approaching the launch of year 5 of the Think Global Awards. And I know last year's winners included people like Visit Sweden, were a winner from last year.
There you go.
There you go. Ulrich Heinz, for example, well known in the localization industry, obviously. And CSA Research, just to name a few. So, what are your thoughts on the awards this year? It's year 5.
I think really getting some traction, and in spite, of course, of the lack of in-person ceremonies last year and this year, really, I think things are way too unpredictable at this stage that we're going to do anything in person. But I think it's really gaining traction. The Oscars of the localization industry, and the amount of applications that we're getting and the quality of those applications. I think in general we've seen that's getting better and better over time. So I would just encourage everyone who has a great story to tell, to apply. We changed the categorization a little bit this year, Simon, I think, but I'll wait for announcement to get into detail here. So there are some good kind of timely ones, seeing how the world is changing.
No, thank you, Unn. I was just interested in your view, because we've seen the awards program grow substantially every year. You're right. We've had the applications continue to just astound us. People from all areas of the world apply for it. Obviously, a lot in the USA, Europe, Asia, example. And we haven't been able to do the awards without at least 10 judges now. It just continues to grow and grow and grow. So we're really excited. It'll be September this year. So stay tuned for that. There'll be more. And you're right. There's some very interesting categories this year. We do like to change them up now and again. And I think there's some that are very, very relevant to maybe the last 12 months that we've all been through. So Okay, so while we're talking about events, because you mentioned sort of the events now are sort of mainly virtual in lots of parts of the world. There are some hybrid events taking place. There's a few in-person events, I know, creeping out, but it's still quite slow for people to return to this in-person. But Vistatec is sponsoring the AMTA, the MT conference, isn't it? The MT Summit.
Yes, that's going to be super interesting. That's next week.
Yeah. And it's also, I know that plans to go to I think it's the 5th year of SlaterCon this year as well. So I know Vistatec has a presence there.
We do. They do a couple a year, I guess. So we'll be there in September as well.
September, yeah. And of course, the long-standing...
Still fully online, yeah.
Yeah, I believe so. I think it's still fully online. And I know you've long-standing relationships still with people like GARA and Localization World, and people in Vistatec are, involved with organizations such as Women in Localization, etc. So
Yeah.
how important is it to how important has it been to maintain the events even in a virtual capacity over the last while? And what do you think the future looks like?
Super important, of course, and we all started to worry about Zoom fatigue, for lack of a better word. And I think everyone is trying to, mix it up, make it as interesting as possible as we go. And I think we've been doing a good job there. I mean, the interesting part with everything being online and not in person, of course, in a way, it's a great equalizer. Apart from time zones, which of course, you may not want to be up at 2 a.m., but really and truly, suddenly people can actually meet regardless of where they are. So that the absence of travel in a way has actually brought people together more closely, which I find very interesting. The future, yes, it's going to be very interesting to see how these hybrid events work out. I know there is, really some quite innovative approaches there to how you bring physical and virtual people into the same room, with maybe life-size screens and little pods and whatever, but we shall see. And at the same time, there's also good advance, I think, in these online networking applications, right, that allow for breakout rooms and whatever, including now little avatars, so you have an avatar with maybe a live head on it and people can go up and shake hands. It's kind of fun, actually. So in a way, I mean, I doubt that things will ever get back to the way they were, but exactly what that looks like, I think, is still in the making. And in the meantime, we as a company will make sure that we cover, that we press on with thought leadership, which is, of course, incredibly important, getting people from, I think, either similar disciplines, or it doesn't have to be disciplines, similar part of the world, similar disciplines, similar interests, similar verticals, anything, or for that matter, sometimes it's even more interesting when people are coming from different angles together in a room to kind of talk about what the future might hold, their challenges, how we might solve them together, how we drive global content forward.
No, thank you, Unn, and interesting in your views on the events there, because it has been very different and continues to be. But I wanted to mention though one event that springs to mind that I know you were involved in was a charity ball event, and
yes.
I know Vistatec it's not really something that we shout about a lot, but I did want to touch on this charity ball event because I thought it was a really nice thing to be involved in. So could you maybe share a little bit of detail about that? Because it was quite an interesting one.
It was a really fantastic event. I think it was really interesting because from a purely human perspective, you actually get to know what people care about and are passionate about. And that's, very nice way to build bridges, and in an environment that is where we really were isolated, bringing people closer together. That's one aspect. I think the other aspect that's interesting here, and again, want to thank Sasha Strauss for his always amazing insights, but for any company today, it's not, enough to just be around. Every company needs a point of view. That doesn't mean that you have to stand up on the barricades or the opposite, right? But it means you need to stand for something, and giving back to the communities in which we work or in which we live is, an important part of being a global citizen. So I think I can't emphasize enough how important the event was, and this is going to be the first of many.
Yeah, no, it was incredible, and I particularly liked how you mentioned Professor Sasha Strauss, how he sort of talked about that important link from an employee perspective, from a customer perspective.
Yeah.
And I thought the charity ball was something that was, if you'd have said to me maybe 3-4 years ago, we're going to do a charity ball during a pandemic and it's all going to be online, I'd have been quite confused. But it was an exceptionally well executed event. I think everybody who attended really enjoyed it. They got a lot out of it. So no, that's great, and great to hear that there's more plans for that. So I look forward to
indeed.
that.
We had, I think we had thought that maybe we would have a VIP event on this theme connected to Local, but I think Local is still, we may still do it, but we were hoping for though was the actual ball gowns, you know, and the
yeah, there's still hope.
But I don't think that's going to happen quite yet.
We're still hopeful.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. Hope springs eternal.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to before we start heading to wrap up here, I do want to ask you a couple of other quick things if I can, because you've had some new shows over the last year and some great discussions have come out of those. And the two that I wanted to ask you about was this fantastic discussion stroke show, which is All Things Global. And I know you've got some key people involved in that, and you've had some wonderful discussions. And I also would like you to touch on maybe X-Cultural, which is a little bit different in itself too. So where did these come from? Who's involved, and what are the plans for these? Because they've been very well received.
Yeah, and both of them I think touch on thought leadership, All Things Global, and it's a bit of an Americanism. Most people over here will get the celebration, I guess, of All Things Considered, which is our National Public Radio news show in the afternoons, and we wanted to do something that had that sense of a deeper dive into topics that are not necessarily focused on localization as a discipline, but rather the forces around localization that drives global content and globalization and what we do forward. So for example, we were talking to David Rosenberg, who is a well-renowned economist, about the homegrown economy and what that means for how we work in general, and how that drives globalization as well. So that was a really, really interesting thought. We, of course, have done one with Professor Sasha Strauss and other people who are working, as said, it's not necessarily localization as a discipline, but rather the big forces around localization. And I find them very informative, I have to say. Now, X-Cultural deals more with, the intersection of passion and culture and global communications, and it's a little bit, I'm not going to say lighter, but it's probably a bit more conversational, less of an interview, deep dive interview, and more conversational with people who represent that cross section. So we have had Iti Sahai now of Chegg, and a few other people just talking about either what drove them and their background, or maybe a common language like baseball.
Yeah, I was listening to the one with Accenture, which I think was one of the latest ones.
Oh, absolutely, about sustainability. Yes,
yeah,
of course.
A very good discussion.
The global concept.
Yeah. No, so more of those to come, I'm assuming.
Absolutely. Oh, there definitely are. I think watch this space. There'll be some new dates out fairly soon.
Very good. So Unn, we've talked about an awful lot there. We've touched on the charity ball, touched on All Things Global. We've mentioned X-Cultural, Think Global Awards coming up. Yeah. We've talked about everything from TMSs and localization decision processes. We even squeezed in Microsoft and 1988 back at the very beginning of our discussion. But before we wrap up, before we end, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience that we haven't maybe discussed today, or anything else you'd like to say?
Well, thank you, Simon. As always, a pleasure. I think one of my thoughts every morning when I wake up these days is like interesting times ahead. And that's, good, bad, or indifferent, right? A lot of challenges for humanity to solve, clearly, but also for how can we as an industry, help drive the changes that are needed for a more, interconnected world, where people communicate clearly to each other and people have equal access to content that's meaningful.
Perfect. Okay. Well, listen, on continued success with everything that you do.
Likewise, thank you.
It's a wonderful journey with new surprises every day. So we
absolutely, never boring, never a dull moment.
Never a dull moment, for sure. Well, look, that's the end of today's show with Unn Villius, Chief Sales Officer here at Vistatec. So please make sure to tune in again to see or listen to the next VistaTalks show, where once again, we hope to be discussing more interesting topics with interesting people from all around the world. Thank you all.
Thank you, Simon.